This is one of the very few times where I don't get to go sit down, which is usually what I do right now, and take a sigh of relief that we have had another successful congregational singing moment. But Pastor Heath asked me to share this evening about our own experience in this series, Thankfulness in the Valley. And so I want to do so, and I want to do so in the manner in which I was asked to do it, which is to tell more of our story and then add at the end the verse or verses that became thematic or in some way informed that place of thanksgiving. And so our situation has to kind of go back to the very beginning of our marriage. And so I'm going to begin first by reading a passage to you that I think kind of directs us into the story, and then kind of tell you a 24-year story in 35 minutes. So do not fear. John 21:18, this is the words of Jesus to Peter after his resurrection. And I want to borrow some thoughts from this text, understanding that the context here is for Peter, but I think there's some things that we can be informed by. So 18 and 19 here. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, this is Jesus speaking, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Now again, the context here is to Peter and is about the death that Peter would die, but I think there is something here for us to understand. Two things that I'll suggest about this text that are applicable to our lives. One is that following Jesus regularly sends us to places we don't want to go in our natural, comfortable state. There are many things about following Christ that involve travail and difficulty and challenges, and left to our own devices, we would choose comfort and ease and hopefulness and joy and avoid difficulty. It is our nature. Sometimes it's our sinful nature that's inclined that way and to a sinful place. So following Jesus does carry us to places we do not want to go. The second thing about this that's applicable to us is here Jesus was speaking about death, Peter's death, and saying this is not the way you're going to want to go, but you're going to go because you're following me. And I think this too is applicable to us from the standpoint of none of us want to face death. We just don't. We know in some measure it is out there for us, there's no escaping it, but we choose to ignore it as long as possible. This isn't just in the culture. This is true about us in the church. We don't have many conversations on a Sunday morning about what it'll be like when we die, or throughout the rest of the week for that matter, because we don't want to talk about it. And yet death is the way that we all must go, that we cannot avoid. And our story speaks to the fear of death. And I will add to that the fear of what I would consider untimely death. We're supposed to live long, healthy lives. That's what we think anyway. We're supposed to be here for a peaceful, delightful 80, 90 years, and maybe at the end we can just fall asleep and die in our sleep and not know any pain or discomfort. I think most would sign up for that if that were an option, but it's not. We don't get to choose how we die. Death carries us to a place we do not want to go. So to our story, I met Mary in Maryland, and I used to tell a really bad joke that I went to the land of Marys and found one, and that's more laughter there than I've ever gotten telling that joke anywhere else. But I found the best one. And so we got married 24 years ago. And they're going to be sending some pictures up for you to see some of these things and see what we used to look like back in that day. I know, it doesn't even look like the same man. Looks like the same woman, but not the same man. We met in Maryland. I was in ministry. She was also involved in ministry. We met. We knew the Lord had us to be married. From the time that we met to the time we were married was less than a year. We knew this is what God was doing. We were right, and it has been wonderful. We have 7 kids. All 7 were born in Maryland. 6 of them boys, 1 girl. Now, Mary will tell you she always wanted a girl, but she wanted lots of boys. I will tell you I'm happy with whatever number of boys, but I wanted a daughter. I just wanted a girl. And so finally, Grace came along as our 6th born. Though that's not what we were trying to do. This wasn't an effort to get to a daughter, just the way the Lord gave them to us. All 7 of our children born in Maryland. I was involved in the pastorate there in a church and had been involved in several types of ministry in Maryland, from youth ministry to worship ministry and actually Christian education. Was a principal of a school, Christian school, and then was sent out as a church planter, was a pastor, preacher. And at this particular point in time where this story picks up, we were closing in on the last part of our tenure where I was a senior pastor of a church, and things were not going well. They were not going well for a number of reasons that are true for a lot of churches where transitions don't go well. I was less than 2 years into the transition of a church that had a long-term pastor, and it was just difficult to get things going in a direction that I could lead. And so I talked to my leadership team and acknowledged that these were challenges that I was facing. They agreed that they were challenges. They thought I should stay and work them out. I knew that that wasn't really what they wanted. They wanted me to stay it and do it the way they wanted me to do it. And I understand that. It's hard to lead when you're not in harmony. So I just begged of them that I could depart peacefully over time. I would look for other occupation, and they would be blessed to go find another pastor. That was about a 6-month process of disagreeing. They agreed was free to go look for another job, but they were not going to look for another pastor. They wanted to sort of strong-arm me back into the role. After 6 months of that, it became clear that I was going elsewhere, but I didn't have a job, which is really hard to leave when you don't have a job and you have 7 children and a mortgage and all those things that come with having a family. So we took a risk. We flew out to Louisville, Kentucky. I did anyway, to inquire about being a student again, trying to work in another area of employment. I looked into several things, selling insurance. Mary found a job for me being a guard at a detention center. I think I'd been really bad at that. We tried a few things to see what we could do. I mean, her appeal was what any wife would. I have faith to go to Louisville, Kentucky with you if you can show me how we can feed 7 children doing that. And I said, that's enough faith. Let's try. Got to Louisville, found out not only would they want to enroll me as a student, but they wanted me to teach. And I felt like that the roles that I'd had were exactly what they needed in someone to teach worship at the seminary. And so we packed up our 7 children. This picture should be coming up, would be Christmas before we left, and moved them to Kentucky. And so as that was 2010, that actually is when we got to Kentucky. That's our family with the 1 girl and the 6 boys. Now, the pay at seminary is not quite what the pay is in the ministry and most churches, and so there was a significant pay cut. But we felt like we could make it with our 10, 9, 8, 6, 5, 3, and almost 1-year-old children. We found a place that we could afford to live in that had enough bedrooms for us. I began my new career. We were homeschooling at the time. We were looking for a church to attend. We did attend a church. We were just looking for a place to get involved. Our kids, the older kids, had been playing hockey in Maryland, and so they were able to keep playing hockey in Kentucky. And I was learning a job for which I had a lot of passion, which was teaching about worship. It looked like a brand new beginning for us. That move was in September of 2010, the week of Thanksgiving. That year, Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 35. She had just turned 35, and there's a lot in that part of the story that she tells really well, and hope you can hear her tell it. But the end result was 3 months into our stay in a place where we knew no one, and apart from family and apart from our network and our churches, we were trying to figure out how to take care of our 7 kids while Mom was going to go through chemo and surgery. She was given a 50% survival rate, that she would make it 5 years or more. And after all the doctor's visits and second opinions, we began chemotherapy in January. We tried that Christmas to make it as magnificent a Christmas as we could make it on the little bit of pay that I was making and the chaos that our life had become in trying to figure out what was going to happen. We also were trying to figure out how many Christmases will we have with Mary, and what can we do to make each one that we get very special. So we let them get up super early that Christmas day, the time that they love to get up on Christmas Day when you're between the ages of 1 and 11. That day was the longest day of our lives. As we tried to stay up with them, they played, they opened presents, they were going all day, 7 kids, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were sure it had to be 10 at night, and it was absolutely not. So we've never done that again, by the way. You don't come out of your room until we tell you you come out of your room. So January came, it was chemo first, and then the surgeries. I went to a local private Christian school. I walked in off the street. I'd just driven by it several times on the way to work, and I said, "You don't know me. I don't know you, but here's my story. We've been here 4 months. My wife has breast cancer. We were homeschooling. I can't pay you anything. Can you please educate our school-age children?" And that school took them in and did. Mary asked me one thing that she persisted in. This is the type of woman that she is and why I love her so much. She said, "I am getting ready to go through chemo. We came here for you to get a PhD and to work. So you promise me this. If I go through chemo, and I am, then you don't miss a day of work and you don't stop the PhD." And what are you going to say to a girl who's getting ready to go through chemo? No, I think I will stop working. I think I'll miss a few days here and there because you're going to miss a few rounds of chemo. No. So I said, yes, I will do exactly what you've asked. And so Mary forced herself into duty as well, almost all the time when she wasn't too sick to get out of bed, and that was rare. And so Mary began chemo. That winter, she caught an infection while her immune system was really, really low, probably 0. She had to be hospitalized. I had to take care of 7 kids and go to work and not stop the PhD. So we didn't know very many people. She ended up being in the hospital alone. I would stop by for 30, 45 minutes at the end of a work day before I could run home and get the kids. But she was literally by herself all day, every day. It got so hard for her as they tried different experimental antibiotics to keep her alive that she got very discouraged and said, "Look, I need to go home. I need to be with my family." And Mary's very persuasive. And she told the doctor, "Look, the way that I feel about life is as important about how I'm actually doing, and I'm not doing real well here with you. So send me home. If anything happens, I'll let you know." And he basically said, "Okay, I will send you home, but let me tell you this. If you spike a fever for anything, even the common cold, you will be dead in 24 hours. So do not fool around with that." She said, "Okay." I picked her up. I brought her home. And within 2 hours, one of our kids began to throw up. And then another. And so I went to the door, and I closed the door, and I said, do not come out here. You don't care what you hear, stay in your room. I've got it under control. And then I got it. And I remember an evening where I was on the floor of the living room with 3 of our boys taking turns with the bucket and just trying to keep life moving forward. Inevitably, Mary got it as well, but the Lord preserved her. But it was not a nice week for us. Carrying the load with treatment, going through what we had gone through financially with the pay cut and trying to feed 7 kids, we really began to struggle financially. Mary was beginning to fight for her life. I was just trying to keep my wits about me and keep things going. And that began to drain us both significantly. There were days when I left in the morning where we did not know what we would eat that evening. Sleep was insufficient, and we were exhausted. But we continued to press forward, thinking, spring surely will come. In fact, we began to share that theme, me more so than Mary. Spring is coming. We played a Stephen Curtis Chapman album called Beauty Will Rise over and over and over. Spring is coming. Indeed, it will come. Well, surely enough, spring in 2011 did come. Very challenging year at school for our kids, but we survived. And I remember telling the kids when I picked them up that day, guys, sometimes survival is winning, so we made it to the end. But that continued a series of 9 surgeries that Mary would go through. And while she was told there was no sign of cancer, we knew it would just be a matter of time where we would watch and wait. By the fall of that year, 2011, financial hardships became so urgent that I had to pick up extra work, and I took on a second job as an interim worship leader. Went from church to church to church in Kentucky to try to find ways to make extra money. Mary was still recovering from treatment. We had the kids into the school that would teach them with an amount we could afford, which was basically nothing. And we held our breath and tried to recover life. Now our kids were almost 12 to almost 2, 12 to 2. September 2012, I began an interim position at a church that we thought would finally be our church, the place where we would root in and settle and be very filled as a family. It also was a chance to continue some extra income and try to pay off some of the debt we had accumulated through treatment as credit cards had been becoming maxed out by paying bills. But our kids were happy. They had their mom back. The boys again were playing hockey. School was a good place for our kids. And it seemed like perhaps spring was indeed going to return. And then in October, as I was on the way to church with the family, I recognized something wasn't quite right in Mary's voice. And I asked her what was bothering her. And she said she'd found another lump. My heart sank as I realized that spring wasn't coming. And now at 37, the 50% survival rate she'd been given 2 years earlier would have been a pipe dream. So in October of that year, she was diagnosed with a recurrence of the same cancer, same area. And we began the second round of fighting cancer. Another 5-month stint of chemotherapy. More aggressive chemo this time. Mary had developed postpartum cardiomyopathy with the birth of our last 2 children. Her heart was susceptible to a particular drug that they like to give breast cancer patients, and so they didn't give it to her the first time. They told her the second time they would have to give it to her. And so they were literally poisoning her heart as they were trying to kill the cancer. But in her optimistic way, she said, remember our deal, I keep doing chemo, you keep doing the PhD, and don't miss a day of work. Yes, dear. At this point, our credit cards were maxed, and even with working 2 jobs and trying to negotiate with creditors, we weren't making it financially. In February, when Mary was in the midst of heavy chemo, our oldest son, Caleb, got very sick. We didn't know what it was. It was a fever that we could not control. It was an infection that we couldn't find a source, and we took him to the urgent care, ER, and they took him by ambulance to the PICU downtown at the Children's Specialist Hospital. Mary has no immune system, so I tell her she can't come. She has to stay home. They could not figure out what was wrong with Caleb. I remember standing in the hospital room watching all these specialists stand around and try to guess at what may be wrong. And finally just decide they didn't know. God was kind. He restored Caleb's health, brought him home, and thought maybe, just maybe, that'll be the end of this nightmare. But then the girl, my daughter, Grace, she was 5. And she'd had pneumonia before, and she was susceptible to it. And she got pneumonia. Same path. We took her to the urgent care ER. They looked at her and said she needs to be in the PICU. And they took her by ambulance. And so now, our 5-year-old daughter is in the PICU. She was placed on oxygen that night, and they told us, this is our most concerned patient we have here tonight, so we're going to watch her very carefully. And I sat there in the room with her as those oxygen sensors alarmed and sounded off, and she struggled to breathe, and it was an agonizing night of asking the Lord, what are we doing here? How am I supposed to endure what's going on? The next day I had to go to work. Remember that promise I made? You keep going to work. So Mary reminded me of that. And I said, well, I've got to stay with Grace. And she said, I'll come stay with Grace. You don't have an immune system. This is an infectious disease floor. They have a piece of red tape across the floor that says don't enter without being masked and gowned. Where are you going to go? I'm not leaving my daughter. So she came in. She stayed with Grace. I went to teach. That morning, we had received a letter, an 8-page letter from a member of the church that I had served in Maryland, informing me that the reason that our family was going through such travail was because of my sin. And that if I would but repent, maybe God would spare us. I know the gospel, and I know that's not the way that God works. But when you are doubled over in the fetal position, and you're begging God for the life of your wife and your daughter, you question everything. That morning, having that letter, having my wife and our daughter in the PICU, we woke up with 11 cents in our checking account and no ability to get money from anywhere else. Mary came into the hospital, laid on the bed with Grace, read to her from the Jesus Storybook Bible, and told her why God doesn't act the way that some church members in Maryland say he does. That afternoon, after teaching, I went to see them both to get an update. They were experimenting with antibiotics because they didn't know which type of pneumonia she had, and they told us that evening, we're going to try this antibiotic. If it works, she'll be better by morning. If it doesn't, she'll be intubated by morning. I left the hospital. My wife is fighting her second round of chemo. My daughter has pneumonia. I have 11 cents. I have enough gas in my car to get me home. But I've got 6 boys waiting to eat. And I remember telling the Lord that day, before getting in the van, I don't know where you're taking me. I don't know how to do this. I trust you, but I don't know if I can go where you think I can go. And I wouldn't get in the van until I could get some sense that God was going to help me put one foot in front of the other. He was taking me somewhere I did not want to go. And I was being forced to consider, do I really trust you? It's real easy to say that I trust you when I'm standing on a platform leading worship. But in those circumstances, it's really hard. Which brings me to Psalm 23, verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And I would suggest 3 things about this passage that became a strengthening bond for me in my relationship with the Lord. First of all was the nearness of God. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. Everyone in this room has experienced a certain amount of suffering, some more so than others, but you know when you are struggling, when you are really suffering, you feel completely isolated from the real world. You feel like everything else is kind of blurry and muffled, and you just are going through motions, and you can't figure out how to get back into reality. But what you also recognize when you're in that place long enough is that there's someone in there with you. Jesus has entered into your suffering. It's a tangible sense that's a gift that can't be experienced in any other way, one that none of us would ask for, but having experienced it, one that none of us would give up. We've all seen the poem, Footprints in the Sand, the 2 sets of footprints, and then the 1 set. And it is incredibly beautiful to think about him carrying us. But you may have also seen the one where you've got the set of footprints and the lines drug in the sand. Or he says, well, what was that? Well, that's when I drug you through what I had to drag you through. Well, in some measure, that's the way suffering is. He drags us through things where he can give us gifts of himself. Because as much as I would love to have the nearness of God in the comfortable times of life, my heart doesn't ache for it the way it does in suffering. But when I'm suffering, I've got an appetite for one thing and one thing only, and that is God. And he fills it. So the nearness of God. The second thing is the confidence in God, your rod and your staff. He leads us to places that we don't want to go, but we find solace in the reality that he's the one leading us there. That was my struggle on the sidewalk that day in downtown Louisville. Okay, I don't understand this, God. I don't want to go here. I don't think I can do what it looks like you may be interested in doing. So help me have the faith to trust you and wherever this is going. If I'm going to have to say goodbye to my wife or to my daughter, I don't know how to do that. So give me faith to trust you. The reminder here is that he has eternal purpose for our temporal sufferings. Romans 8:18 says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. That's what God does. Takes temporal sufferings and gives eternal glory. And finally, the comfort of God. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So how did I get back in the van that day and drive home? It wasn't because anything about my circumstances changed, because they did not. It was because God comforted me. So nothing about my life was any different sitting in the driver's seat of my 12-passenger van. What was different is God had entered in and comforted. This is a supernatural act of God to give us a peace that passes all understanding. It makes no sense whatsoever except that this is God, and his presence alone causes comfort to come into a heart that is broken and troubled by many things. It's more than the feeling of peace. It's the transformation that his peace brings. It changes us. It deepens us. It draws us near to him, and it makes us more like Christ. Here are some of the changes that I experienced as I finished this. I just want to give you kind of 3 things that I think back on this and go, here's where I'm different now because of that season. Clearly, the Lord restored Grace, his health. Miraculously, clearly, the Lord gave Mary life. He didn't have to do those things. He did. He gave us the opportunity to enjoy watching our children grow up. Now we have young adults and starting to see them move into their own spheres of building families. At least the first is married now. But here are the things that we learned 10, 12 years ago. Eternal things matter much more than temporal things, even really important temporal things. Eternal things are always more important, and God will get at those eternal things. And in that category, the second thing that I learned is people are so precious. You know, it's really easy to be given to a lot of things in life other than people. I had a student writing a paper once for me. It was a philosophy of worship ministry paper. I love worship ministry. I can't wait to be involved with it. The least favorite part I have about worship ministry are the people. If I could get rid of the people, I would really enjoy it above all else. He was very serious. And I asked to have lunch with him. And I sat down with him in the cafeteria, and I said, tell me, is this really what you meant in your paper? And he said, well, yeah, people are a mess. They get in the way. I said, please don't go into ministry. You have no business being in it. People are precious. And I would like to add to that, husbands and wives, you can take the counterpart to this. Husbands, you should have to seriously consider losing your wife and think about the gift that she is. I love my wife. I loved her way before anything happened in 2010, 2012. But my goodness, do I love her now. I didn't know I was going to have these days with her. And I have them. So every day is a gift. And then finally, Jesus is more real, and my orientation to him is more consistent because of what I went through. Jesus is more real. He was real before, but my, is he real now? Because I walked with him in the valley when no one else could walk with me. And I felt his nearness and heard his voice. And he showed me that I could be closer to him than ever before if I would but trust him. So whatever you're going through, your story may not turn out like mine. It certainly may not turn out with some of the same details. God was kind to us. We have certainly things that are not the same because of that experience, but we have many, many rich blessings that are better than we deserve. And so as we look at what God has done now, we just have amplified reasons to worship him and to praise him and to thank him. But whatever you're going through, you may not be able to see a picture like this one right now. You may not be able to see what the future will hold. You may have no ability to know that the future has anything good in it. We didn't, and that's not the point of suffering. The point of suffering is thanking him for it in the midst of it, not for what you hope he'll do with it. He's the gift, not the change of circumstances that we're begging him for. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for how you were with our family in such a profound way in those years from 2010 to 2015. And our family has never walked the same since then. Neither Mary nor I are the same. Our kids are not the same. We treasure things that we didn't know we should be treasuring. And we disregard things that we used to treasure. Thank you that you gave us that experience of suffering. Thank you that, as Mary has said many, many times, I would not wish cancer upon anyone, but I would wish what cancer taught me about Jesus and his gospel on everyone. Lord, that's our wish here tonight. That's our desire. That's our prayer, that you will show people in this room how important you are and how powerful your gospel is. In Jesus' name, amen.